Welcome to the Pen to Publish podcast from the two Alexas. If you're planning to pen and publish or are penning at the moment, then you're definitely in the right place. We talk all about the writing and publishing process, and we know this podcast is helping hundreds of writers all over the globe. I'm Alexa Whitten, author, typesetter, and independent publisher. And
I'm Alexa Tewksbury, author, editor, and proofreader. We have many writing resources for you, including our brand new Pen to Published website, where you can get all the show notes and guest information. We've interviewed some really interesting writers and authors, and there's also our Writers Refinery Facebook group, which is available for you to join. We love getting feedback, so do please leave us a review, and don't forget to hit subscribe so that all the latest episodes pop up in your podcast feed. So let's get started.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Pen to Publish podcast. And today we are joined by the lovely Rebecca Cole, who we are going to be working on her book, and she's going to be telling us all about it in this episode. But first, let me just quickly tell you a little bit about Rebecca, and then we'll introduce you, and Rebecca can come and say hello. So Rebecca, or Becky, as she is affectionately known, picked up sewing as a hobby at the age of 7, and she has been sewing for over 30 years with 20 years professional experience. I'd imagine that must be very handy. I wonder if people come to you going, "Oh, can you just whip this up for me, please?" You probably get that all the time.
You'd get it from me.
She trained at the College of London Fashion as a period pattern cutter for film, television and theatre, graduating with honours. I wouldn't expect anything else, Becky. After securing a BBC training placement with a costume team on a children's drama, Becky spent the first years of her professional life working up from the position of costume trainee to supervisor, and then working on many high-profile projects such as Waking the Dead, Primeval, The It Crowd, Black Mirror, Misfits, Worst Week of My Life, The Robinsons, My Hero, and Big Top. And with well-known actors such as Sophie Thompson, Martin Freeman, Hugh Bonneville, Sue Johnson, Tony Robertson, Anna Massey, Ben Miller, Amanda Holden, and Olivia Colman. I mean, wow! Amazing. I mean, some of those people in there. I mean, Olivia Colman, girl crush on her for sure.
Yeah, me too.
Then in 2009, after deciding to focus on starting her family, Becky made the decision to move away from the television industry and transfer her sewing and pattern cutting skills to making bespoke wedding gowns and evening wear, although I do know that she has gone back to TV, but all will be revealed in the podcast. And then in 2018, Rebecca was invited to join the team at Create and Craft TV, sharing her knowledge and expertise with viewers, demonstrating sewing machines and fabrics, working with brands such as Brother, Craft Cotton Co., Tilda, Moda, Highlight Crafts, Marathon, and Oliso. Is that how you pronounce that? Oliso? Jobs which she still loves and does today. Wow, Rebecca, your bio really is something of dreams. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So tell us a little bit. I mean, I know we've got some questions already, but just you're going to have to spill the guts, I'm afraid. I'm sorry. I'm adding this question here ad lib. Olivia Colman, is she as lovely as she seems?
She really is. It was a fair old while ago that I worked with her. She days before the Oscars and all of that kind of thing. It was around the time she was sort of doing Peep Show and those kinds of things. And yeah, she is absolutely adorable. And the person you see on screen, you remember her Oscar speech? That is exactly what she's like to talk to in real life. She's one of my favourites.
Wow.
Yeah.
So your background really has been from a very young age. You've obviously loved to sew. And then this is obviously your passion. So you obviously started at a very young age. Why did you then decide to explore the all access side of things? And by all access, perhaps you can give us a little bit of a background with what we mean by all access, because this is really the focus that you're having now, especially with the book, but also with what you're doing day to day, I would say.
Yes. So as you said, I've sewn since I was 7. I don't know where it came from. I kind of do, I think. At the age of 39, I realised I was autistic. And in the 2 years since, I've also been diagnosed with Vernon syndrome and also ADHD. So I have had this my whole life, but it's only been something I've been aware of in the last couple of years. And looking back, I'm like, well, I don't really know why I got into sewing, but actually, I would sit in front of the television and cross stitch, and I would sit in and do embroidery or something because I couldn't just sit there and not do anything. And this was the day before mobile phones when you could sit and scroll on your phone and watch the TV. And so I had to do something. I've never been overly physically active, but I just cannot sit and do nothing. So I think it's probably sort of stemmed from there, and just the hyper focus of it. Growing up an undiagnosed neurodivergent child in the 80s and 90s, when, let's face it, understanding wasn't overly great. I mean, in those days, the diagnosis was given to a parent almost with the gravity and weight of a death sentence. This, if the equivalent of if you were being told your child had cancer. It was so misunderstood and underdiagnosed in those days. And, I think so I was never diagnosed as a child. It wasn't a thing girls could get really when I was a child. But it meant that I grew up in a world not quite working out why I didn't really fit. I just felt like a broken person. And people say, oh, well, why do you want to label yourself? Because I'd already labeled myself a broken failure of a human. I much prefer this label over that one because there's a reason why my brain works this way. But it meant I was very picked on at school. I struggled with friendships, a lot of alienation by my peers, not really understanding why. And my sort of, in those days, schools did sewing lessons, and the art department and the textiles department and the teachers involved in those lessons, it kind of became my safe place. And they saw my talent, they saw my enthusiasm and passion, and they nurtured me. And it was a place I thrived rather than felt like I was always sort of falling behind. I mean, I did very well at school. I was very academic, but in terms of feeling like I fit. I always fit in that environment. And it's just something I've attempted to walk away from it several times. And I always end up back with it. And I just think, I've just embraced it now with who I am. So now it's the all access side of things is about realizing how ableist the craft. I mean, all industries are ableist. Everybody has a lot of internal ableism because of the narrative of which we've grown up. But it's about addressing that and changing it and trying to make things better. And my corner of the world is a sewing corner, and so I can address it from there, really.
I would imagine, Alexa, from your experience too, you can probably resonate with quite a few things that Rebecca's saying as well, I'd imagine.
Yeah, I mean, my son was diagnosed with autism in 1990, so right in the middle of that period that you're talking about. And it was almost, I was doing lots of research once it became a possibility, because the first thing that people thought he had was dyspraxia, which is also called developmental coordination disorder. And that was originally what the school picked up on once he started school. And then we started seeing a clinical psychologist. And then somebody had actually mentioned the word autism to me. And at that stage, I knew nothing about autism. And we went to the clinical psychologist and he had to take him for regular sort of sessions, and he was testing all sorts of things. And he was eventually diagnosed with Asperger's, which I don't think people are diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome anymore. But Asperger's syndrome was presented as high functioning autism. And my son hates the term high functioning autism because it's so much more complex than that. And it's quite derogatory if you're labelled low functioning as well. But for him, there are so many complexities. There are physical aspects. His movement is severely affected by the dyspraxia or the developmental coordination. His handwriting looks very much like a 4-year-old's. He was supported in school. This was the difference, from you, Rebecca. He was supported in school because he was diagnosed at 6, because his teacher, because I've been saying since about 3 years old, it's just not, I'm watching other children in this toddler group. He's not doing what they're doing. And the health visitors, I don't know if it's the same now, but at that time you would go to regular health visitors and they would look at their progress. There'd be certain milestones, and I'd say, but this isn't happening, and this, oh, it's boys. It's like that with boys. They're always slower. And so there were definite things going on here. Do you remember those stacking toys you used to get where you put like hoops?
Cups.
And
cups
and
as
cups,
well.
yes.
Yeah.
He couldn't do it. He couldn't create the pattern of it. Couldn't do it. Those push and ride toys you'd sit on and scoot yourself around, which I always thought looked really fun. He couldn't do it. Couldn't work it together. And he has something called, which always makes me smile, but called executive dysfunction. So there's this disorganization, an inability to disorganize. And before we started recording, Rebecca, you were saying about, don't interrupt me because I can't switch. He can't switch. And which is sometimes difficult because sometimes I need to go in your room and do this, or I need to ask you this now because something's happening now. And so, yeah, sometimes I just have to push on through.
I think especially when us creatives probably do multitasking quite well. Like
yes.
I'm the opposite. I can multitask almost too much. I can switch from one thing to another on a dime. And I think sometimes when you're obviously dealing with someone that really struggles with that, it's like, I don't understand why someone isn't able to do what I can do. And like you were saying, Becky, you've had to teach your children and your family members, look, this is just the way I am. So we're going to have to make some changes with how you don't interrupt me, or just allow for the fact that, if I need interrupting, you're going to get the hand and you're going to have to come back to me when I'm ready.
Yeah.
One thing the clinical psychologist said, or it might have been the pediatrician, I can't remember. We saw so many people. They said was, have you noticed how your life revolves around him? And I was thinking, well, no, it doesn't. And then I thought, oh my word, it does. Actually, everything is geared towards coping with this thing and trying to relate. I had to change the car once, and it was so upsetting to him. He couldn't cope with the fact that we'd had to change the car. And if there was anything, if I needed to get him a new mattress or something, I had to relate it to his passion, which was motorsport. I said something like, because at that point he was really into Damon Hill, who had won the F1, and I'd said to him, well, look, the thing is, if Damon Hill ever comes to stay with us, he's going to need a comfy bed, because he's going to need lots of sleep. And that was how I was able to persuade him. Because if I could relate it constantly to the things that he was passionate about, but I did. It took somebody like the pediatrician or whoever it was to say it. But I thought, actually, yes, our life has evolved the way it's needed to accommodate.
The difficulty is the world is geared towards neurotypical people, and if your brain works in a different way, the world is not made for us. We don't fit in it's a bit like being an alien on a different planet. Imagine being dropped on Mars and expected to just cope, and I know that's sort of an extreme example, but it's the so out of the four of us in this house, three of us are autistic ADHD. So there's a lot of, and we all have completely different needs. So there is a lot of having to work out accommodations and adjustments and so on and so forth.
Okay, so discovering that you were neurodivergent, how did this then lead on to working with your diagnosis and then going on to working with people in the BBC? Because I know you worked on the Sewing Bee. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how that came about and how nice it was for neurotypical person, people like me, to see someone clearly with a disability in the not last series but the series before, with a contestant that had one arm and was doing the sewing competition. So tell us a little bit about that.
So I did work on the Sewing Bee. I worked on season 8 of the Sewing Bee, and that came about. So I my first sort of career was in TV doing the costume side of things. And I think you mentioned in the beginning, I sort of stepped away around 2009 to start my family. Actually, what happened there was I was in autistic burnout, but I didn't realize it. And no matter how hard I worked, it was a very schmoozy industry back then. It's much better now, but it was very much who you knew and not what you knew. And I was never judged on my ability to do the job. I was always judged on who I'd made friends with. And for me, obviously, that wasn't easy. And I was never asked back for second series. I was never invited back on different jobs with the same team. And I just was so burnt out from trying, even though I was really good at the job. So that's why I kind of walked away. And then in 2021, there was an advert that started doing the rounds on social media for somebody to come and join the Sewing Bee team. And it was really weird. It was one of those, I'm a big believer in the universe and manifesting and, signs from the universe. And I read it and it was almost like it said, "Dear Becky, do you want to come and do this job?" I knew it was my job and I don't know why, but I've never been more qualified for anything. So I decided, right, let's venture back into the world of TV. And this is now on the production side rather than the costume side. So I was assistant sewing producer, which sewing producer is somebody who kind of bridges the gap between the people who know how to make the television and the people who know how to sew. And when you're making a sewing program, the sewing producer bridges that gap. I knew how TV was made, and I also knew how to sew. So my job was working with the contestants on them, planning their made to measures and helping run the floor during the challenges and that kind of thing. And yeah, but it did occur exactly at the same time as I realised I was autistic. So while I was living in a hotel room in Leeds for 2 months away from my friends and family, I was doing a very intensive job and unpacking every little incident I'd ever lived in my 39 years through a lens of being autistic. And so it was a very emotionally challenging time for me. I loved the job, but I was not in a good state when I left. When after we finished, it was all wrapped up, went into edit, my job was done. I was not in a good place at all. And, it took me a while to kind of get back on my feet, and I did manage it and it was fine. When you learn something about yourself, like you've been living with three disabilities your entire life and never known about it. It's sort of, for me, it was an incredibly positive experience, but also emotionally challenging because you are reassessing everything you've ever done, all those mistakes, all that shame you carry for, you do reassess it and readdress it and talk to yourself in a different way. So the Sewing Bee was wonderful. Contestants were lovely. Obviously Jill Thomas was on that series. So that was sort of one of my early conscious, should we say, exposures to working with people who sew and also live with a disability. And she was incredible and amazing. And she's a lovely person and a good friend. So, it was a really, really wonderful experience. And then that then led to being invited to be sewing producer on a show called Unique Boutique, which has just aired this year. It was out in July, and that was on Channel 4. And that was, it was almost like the universe delivered that one on it to me as well, because I was invited to come and do the role, but it was all about fashion and accessibility. And I was the sewing producer, and it was my job to work with these incredible people with disabilities and just different body shapes. It wasn't just disabilities as well, working with a crew who were vast majority disabled or neurodivergent. And it was such an inclusive and accommodating place. It was very much one of those moments where it was like, do you know what, the TV industry can be inclusive and it can be accommodating. And I think it really started conversations in the broader public's eye that the fashion industry just does not serve.
I mean, I watched several of the shows, and talk about, like you said, all inclusive. I've never seen a show like it because it featured, you know how you see shows, it's the same with like male dominated shows. Isn't there a law now with shows you can't have just now an all male panel? There has to be a woman on it as well now. And I've noticed this in the sports industry as well. There's like sports shows, there's always a female there, but there's always just one, right? There's always one token whoever. And the lovely thing about Unique Boutique is it is all focused on people who have either disabilities or either hidden or shown or whatever. They're not the one person out of four, you know, it's all inclusive. And I would imagine it's probably a show that hasn't been anything like that before.
There really hasn't. And actually, talking about sort of the roles of women, I mean, the executive producer was a woman, the producer was a woman, the director was a woman, the production manager was a woman. Obviously, I was there as sound producer. I'm a woman. You know, it was such a female-led creative project as well, it was wonderful. It really, really was a wonderful thing to be a part of. So yeah.
And then obviously from that, we've got your book.
Yes. Well, the book has been in some form or another in the back of my mind for a long time. So with the book, my aim is to make sewing more accessible for disabled and neurodivergent people. And what happened when I learned about my own disabilities was one of the things I struggle with is how clothes feel on my body. And I realized I had been dressing for for how I thought other people would expect me to look. If I don't dress this way, I won't be accepted. My whole life has been looking for that magic ingredient that suddenly I will be accepted for who I am. And clothing was one of those ways I used to try and do that. And it's uncomfortable. It would cause me stress. And, we talk about executive function. Actually, for neurodivergent, well, I can't speak for all neurodivergent people, but for my own experience and for a vast number of neurodivergent people, the problem with executive dysfunction is your executive function is what enables you to do your day-to-day stuff. So building habits, for a neurotypical person, quite often getting up and brushing your teeth or getting into the shower, it's an automatic process. There's no thoughts involved. For somebody with executive dysfunction, nothing happens on automatic pilot. It's a conscious decision to go and do this thing, to go and brush my teeth, to go and get in the shower, and everything has to be thought through. So it would be, all right, well, I've got to be out of the house by then, so I need to do this and I need to do that. And even down to, right, to get in the shower, shall I go to the toilet first? Shall I brush my teeth first? Should I take my medication first? Or well, I need to get unchanged, but I won't flush the loo because that will make the shower run cold. So I'll flush the toilet when I get out of the shower. Everything is a conscious process and it's exhausting. Life is exhausting when you have executive dysfunction. And getting dressed in the morning was one of those areas where my executive dysfunction just would go haywire, because I'd open my wardrobe to be presented with all these clothes that didn't really feel comfortable. And then it's, right, is it going to rain today? Is it going to be hot, cold? Do I need to leave the house? How am I feeling? Am I feeling overwhelmed already? Have I got energy? Am I going to be seeing people? Do I need to look professional? Do I need, And so getting dressed, we talk about spoons as, a form of energy. If you look up spoon theory, we use the language of spoons all the time. And for a neurotypical person, it might only take a couple of spoons of energy to get dressed in the morning. For me, it could take 10, 12, 15. If I've only got 10 for the day because I'm already overwhelmed or burnt out, I'm already in negative spoons even before I've left the house. So I decided that what I needed to do was make my dressing process, my wardrobe, as accessible as possible. So I pulled out everything that didn't make me feel comfortable or fill me with joy or just felt nice to wear on my body. And I literally was left with maybe 10 things, and it was all leggings, hoodies, strappy tops. And that meant I could put on whatever I wanted and it felt wonderful. But I lost all sense of style then. There was nothing in my wardrobe that was me. It was, these are great if I'm just lounging around the house, but what do I wear to work? What if I want to go to a wedding, or, what can I wear? So it's like, I've got all these skills, all these dressmaking skills, these pattern cutting skills. So I started to make my own clothes again from fabrics that felt wonderful in styles that I knew felt good on my body. I love a bat wing because I hate it when clothes are tight under my arms. So, I would go to charity shops and buy bat wing tops or, clothes that felt nice on my body. And either take patterns from them and remake them or adapt them. A lot of the clothes in my wardrobe I then adapted. So I took all the waistbands off of my jeans and put an elasticated ribbing waistband on them because I can't deal with solid waistbands. So I started doing all of this stuff and documenting it a bit on social media. I'm not very good at social media. I tried to document it on social media. And then when I sort of went into Unique Boutique, and I suddenly realized that this is a community-wide issue with disabilities, and I knew the difference it had made to my life. I was suddenly dressing felt empowering, and all these other people was having the same experience, having things made for them. And I think Unique Boutique was wonderful because it started that conversation and it really brought to the forefront of people's minds that this is an issue. But where my skills and my passion lies is actually teaching people how to do it themselves and empower them to do what I have done with my wardrobe. So, whatever your disability is or your neurodivergency is and your particular needs, because somebody else who's autistic or ADHD might have different sensory needs to myself. The idea of this book came about because it was like, I want to help inspire and empower people to look in their wardrobes and go, what isn't serving me? And this is how I put it right. And it's not just about, it's for everybody. That's the all access. I'm calling it the ramp of sewing books, because accessibility isn't about accommodating disabled people. It's about creating an environment that is accessible to everyone. So, stairs allow an ambulatory person into a building, a ramp allows everybody into the building. So that's why I've sort of been calling it the ramp of sewing books. But that alteration that I'd said about taking the waistbands off my jeans and adding the elasticated waistband, it works if you have sensory issues, but it also works if you're in a wheelchair, or if you have a stoma bag or nephrostomy bags or a catheter or a feeding tube, or if you're pregnant, or if dexterity issues, you can't deal with buttons and zips and things, or even if you just have something like IBS or Crohn's disease, or, those things that aren't necessarily classed as a disability, maybe, but, your body swells during the day. You might be going through menopause and you might go up 2 or 3 dress sizes in the day. Or do you know what? If you just prefer an elasticated waistband, anybody can do that to their trousers, make their trousers work for them without having to go and buy any new clothing. And it works for everybody. And that's kind of the ethos behind the book.
So obviously with your experience of doing all of this, and did you find then it was because of your experience, because I think if I'm right in saying this, and obviously with Unique Boutique, you actually helped make sure that the patterns were written in an inclusive way. Is that correct? Because there's quite a skill set, isn't there, in how you write instructions, I would imagine.
I mean, I didn't write any instructions for Unique Boutique because my sewing team were making the garments. So my job was to coordinate all of it. It was almost like a project management role, really, with all the sort of telly stuff mixed in. But, with my work with Create and Craft, and I've written for a few magazines and things like that, I've always written how-to projects. It's been something I've done for a really, really long time. And I've automatically been writing them in an accessible way because of how I need to access things, even before I knew that was why I was doing it. So my aim is to, that everything is very clear. We're using a sans serif font because that is better for dyslexics. It's all, as much of it is going to be bullet points and short paragraphs so that there's nothing overwhelming in there. Trying to just make things as clear and concise as possible, because my ADHD brain won't let me read long passages of text. The way my brain processes information, I can struggle if there's lots of complicated words. And it's not that I don't understand the words, it's just kind of my brain turns anything written into a visual in my brain, and that process can take longer if it's very wordy or if there's lots going on. And then I'm also very visual. So I've made sure that there are clear pictures, and I've always done this, made sure there's clear pictures and that the wording works with the pictures. And if you need more pictures to describe that process, then that's great. And ideally what I'd like to do long term is actually also do videos on, so people can have access to videos on how to do this stuff as well, so that all learning styles are accommodated. When it comes to writing projects, I can be very wordy when I'm writing, so I'm hoping this is where the lovely Alexa comes in and goes, this is all unnecessary guff, we don't need any of it.
We talked about this today, actually, saying Becky likes things concise, but she's a very wordy author. So yeah, this is where Alexa Tewkesbury will come in with her magic, no doubt.
I think
paring down.
Yes.
Please do. I think the important thing is I can write from my own experience, but although I want this to be an all-inclusive book, there is no way on this planet that I can accommodate every single person and their needs. So for starters, I'm very open to feedback. Please, nice constructive feedback. Horrible feedback. I also have rejection sensitivity dysphoria, so please be nice to me. But I'm very open to feedback of, do you know what, if you did this, it would be really great, and it would help this person, or this, this is my struggle. And, so should there be additional books, or, with the website or anything like that, like, I don't assume or presume that I have all the answers. I definitely do not. And I think, I'm very open to being told, this is just, you've repeated yourself 4 times here, let's make this 1 sentence. So, and that's what I want for the book. And if my skill set is not in making it as concise as possible, and easy to read as possible, that's why I love working with people like you guys, because that's your area of expertise, and together we can make something that is as accessible as we can possibly make it in this time and space.
Yeah. So would you say that there's a lack of resources for people with disabilities in this genre? Because I know that I've seen so many things on social media and conversations I've had of parents with a child with a physical disability, who the children are looking at children's books and saying, well, where am I? This is in fiction, obviously, but where am I in this? I'm not in that picture. I don't figure. So do you think that's the same here? There's just a lack of resources.
I think so. It's the same in any industry, in any part of any area of life, really. We're only really now starting to have the conversations around disability, accessibility, in all sorts of areas. And, I think that's one of the things we have to thank the internet for, because it's making these worldwide conversations. It's giving people a platform to say, but what about me? Representation is so important. And I get so excited when I see, people of all kinds of abilities with all sorts of disabilities or challenges, or, represented on screen, for example. It's wonderful, because it means that the message is getting out there. Definitely the crafting world struggle, there's not a lot of representation in the crafting world, but ironically, crafting is huge for the disabled community, because, take lockdown, for example. We were all thrown into a situation where we're all locked in our homes. We can't go out and socialize. We can't, our routines are disrupted. Mental health starts to suffer, and craft sales went through the roof. People were buying sewing machines. They were buying crafting kits. They were teaching themselves to crochet. They were learning pottery, all of these different things, all these different crafts, because it's well known as being a form of meditation, being a form of therapy. And actually, I interview several different disabled sewers in the book, and the common sort of theme was, I used to sew, I then became disabled, and I just thought, there's no way I can sew anymore. And I managed to get back into it through making a few accommodations, and it became my therapy. It became my way of recuperating back into my new life. And they share their tips and you know, how they lay out their sewing room, the kinds of pieces of equipment they have in their sewing boxes, little hints and tips. And it's been absolutely fascinating I've learned so much, because obviously I can speak from my side of things, but I would never ever appropriate another person's experience. So, you know, crafting is massive in the disabled community, within the disabled community, people who are home, you know, bedbound, for example, or can't leave the house, or mobility issues. But in terms of accommodating that, I think there's an awful long way to go. So I'm hoping this book and the information in it will be sort of a catalyst to start those conversations.
Yeah, I'm sure it will. So what do you look out for in your own writing? Like, have you got tips for other authors? I edit a lot of fiction, but I also edit non-fiction, and but I think it's very specific, isn't it? A craft book, that you're talking about clarity, and then you're adding another level of clarity on top of that, because you want to make sure that there's nothing that's going to phase people who are neurodivergent.
Absolutely. I think, I mean, I've wanted to be an author since I can't remember, my two goals. You know, when you're a kid and they say, what do you want to be when you grow up? I want to be a fashion designer and an author. That was my two things. And I would spend hours writing little stories. And I've still got them upstairs somewhere in a box, all these stories I wrote. So it's been a dream of mine, but I've never really known how to make it happen. So this is really important to me, from that point of view. I think when I've been writing it, because it is my first experience of writing, it's my first book. So I'm learning as I'm going, you know, I'm learning how I function as an author. So, you know, things like, what do I look for? I'm learning that as I go, but I've noticed I very much want it to sound like my voice. I don't want it to be clinical or cold. I want it to be my personality on the pages, especially sort of, you know, not so much the interviews, although that's obviously had an additional layer of challenge. But, you know, the bits that are in my voice, I want it to sound like my personality, but also at the same time, you know, be accommodating and everything else. I think my main challenge with it has been, I'm so used to masking in my life that I don't always realize when I'm doing it. And the other thing I do, and it's very common for autistic people, is to mimic and take on the personalities of the people they're talking to or the people around them. You know, I might watch a TV show and I think suddenly I become that character for a little bit. I start talking like them, or it's a coping strategy that you develop in life when you're just trying to fit in, and you're like, well, if I copy you seem to be functioning pretty well, I'll just copy you. So I've always done that, and I'm very aware, and again I think this is where you will come in when you're looking through the book, that I want it to sound like me. So as I'm writing it, I'm going, is this me writing, or have I taken on a persona, or am I, you know, I read a book while I was on holiday, and it was an autobiography, and I was writing, and I suddenly found I was using quirks and mannerisms and wording that I'd read in this book, and I was like, that's her personality, not mine. So I think that's my biggest challenge, is to make sure that I am writing from a consistent voice, and that I'm not hiding who I am or trying to be somebody else. And I think the way I've kind of dealt with that, and you say about tips for other authors, I would say the way I've dealt with that is to write it, go back to it the next day and reread it and rewrite it, and do that 2 or 3 times, and then
Dream client. We try and get people to do this and they don't. So, you know,
right.
Awesome. Well done.
Well, I'm trying to do that because I can instantly, it's funny, once I've taken a break from something and I go back to it, I can instantly go, that's not me, that's not my voice, and sort of change it a bit and do that a couple of times. And it's helping me to stay on track, that I'm writing in a consistent voice. But then obviously when you add in the interviews, that's a different layer of voices.
So that's more of a challenge for you than writing in an inclusive way, because I suppose in some ways it's natural to write in an inclusive way because you're writing how you would understand it.
Yes, I've always written how I would want to read something. Like I said, my struggle with that is being I can be quite wordy and just go off on random tangents, which again is an ADHD thing. So that's where second and third pairs of eyes is great, because it's like, no, we can get this message out in a much more accessible, in simpler way, you know.
I think Alexa Tewkesbury, basically just have your bullet point hat on. Because I also do think, though, that as a reader, that there's a fine line between being conversational, which people like, to broken up in bullet points, which is great. But you don't want a book that is just bullet points, because that also is too hard work. So it's finding that balance, isn't it? And I think the lovely thing about your interviews is that breaks up also the text, which is a nice sort of breathing space, because you could go and read an interview while having a cup of coffee. And I think also with the interviews that I've seen so far, I think a little bit of you comes out in them too, because obviously you've rewritten them really from your interview. And I quite like the fact that it's not just a straight transcript. It's coming from the lens of you as well, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's been the difficulty with the interviews. I mean, all four of the women I've interviewed are just incredible humans and so inspiring. And I've really enjoyed those conversations, because, like I say, I know things from my lens, but I certainly don't know. I can't speak for anyone else. And then their sort of experiences of life and sewing and managing their disabilities and making their sewing passion accessible for them has been amazing. I do this, and it's like, well, why did I not think of that? But of course, it's not something I would think to do. There's a lady who struggles with pins. So you can buy a basting spray, a temporary adhesive basting sewing spray. She sprays her fabric, lies her pattern pieces down, and cuts them out so she doesn't have to pin them. And it was just like, that's genius. Absolute genius. So that's one of her top tips in the book. And it's full of little gold nuggets that I just, that I couldn't, I can share that with people I think will help, but it's not an accommodation I would need to make for myself. So, they've been wonderful to do, but then when I'm writing them up, I want it to be their voice, but I'm writing it in the first person, but it's also me writing it. So there's been this sort of, I don't want to hide their voice, but it's going to have to be my voice because I'm writing it. And yeah, so that's been an interesting challenge. Hopefully I've got the balance right. You'll soon tell me if I haven't. But I think the interviews have been my favorite part of the book, because I think those are the bits where the light bulb moments happen, and everybody's sort of I've asked for a line of advice, one piece of advice you could give anybody out there, and it's been just have a go. You've got nothing to lose. And I love that. I love that.
Be prepared to fail. I think as creatives, certainly from my point of view, as a neurotypical person, from my point of view, we have fear of failure. We do. And I'm an artistic person by nature. And sometimes I catch myself stopping doing a creative project, which I love to do, because I don't want to get it wrong, which is ridiculous, because the only person that's going to be looking at it is me. But we've got this, I don't know if it's a human characteristic. We just have this fear of failure, fear of getting it wrong, fear of looking stupid, when no one's going to be looking at it other than us. But that still stops me from starting, because I don't want it to be rubbish. I want it to be perfect. And I think we also get this with authors. A lot of people, funnily enough, it's at the end of the project that they get cold feet, because they want their book to be perfect. And I've got a client at the moment who is going through this very typical stage, and he is, I believe, autistic himself, if I remember rightly. Lovely chap, really enjoyed working with him, but hyper focused on some very interesting bits of the book. And he's got to the bit of the book now where he doesn't want to press print because he wants perfection.
Yeah.
And it's one thing Alexa and I say a lot is there is not a perfect book. And the other thing that I tell a lot of my clients, and that is, you're doing your future readers a disservice by holding on to the information that you need to get out.
Well, I think you gave me that advice right at the beginning, because I think the hardest thing for me in that sense has been, so I have something called RSD, rejection sensitivity dysphoria, which is very, very common with ADHD. And it is a very, very extreme emotional and physiological response to perceived rejection. So it's not just feeling bad that somebody has rejected you, it is assuming that everyone hates you, nobody is interested in what you're going to say, and just, you know, it's very disabling, very disabling. And the minute I sort of said yes to you guys, let's do this, that kicked in like the highest levels I've ever experienced of who are you to do this, who are you to say this, who are you to think you can be an author or share this message. No one's interested in what you've got to say. It's just going to be a flunk. The whole disabled community are going to hate you, and you know, and I think I sort of brought this up with you, and you said, but if you don't write this, who will?
Well, exactly. And you're doing the people who are going to read this a disservice by sitting on your passion and your knowledge.
Yeah,
you know?
Absolutely.
And I always say this as a way of, because I had my book, I had a book sitting on my hard drive for 4 years because I was worried, like, okay, I teach people how to write books, but who am I to write a book? Right. And I teach people how to do this. It's ludicrous. But in your head, you're thinking, well, who am I? I'm going to be judged. People are going to say you're rubbish. You know, you're putting your head above the parapet. People are going to say, who do you think you are? All of the reasons you said. And then it was someone that said to me, just get out of your own way. You're being selfish. And when it turned on that way of I was being selfish by holding my information in, I think then it is like, you know, you were saying earlier on about there's a calling. It's like, this is your purpose. Your purpose from a very young age was to be a sewer and to be an author. That was your purpose. And this is your purpose. This is where you're right. This is where you need to be. This is where you need to be. And when you're with us, this is why we love to do what we do. We will make sure that your book is the best it can be. It won't be perfect because no book is. And who wants perfection? It's overrated. But it's going to be accessible to all, and that's the main thing, right? So
absolutely.
And on that, what's important for you with the book? So in terms of the way it looks, how it feels, the